You know, people have wondered sometimes, and they've asked me, you know, where's the superego and the ego and the id located in the brain? And, you know, it's a stupid question, and it's not a stupid question at the same time. It's actually a useful question at one level of analysis, because you could say, well, the id, from the Freudian perspective, is sort of the natural force that propels motivation, you know. And it's, when we say motivation, we're not saying much different than saying id, by the way. You know, it's the same kind of low-resolution word. And it's clearly the case that we have fundamental motivational systems, and that we do share them with animals, and that they do drive our behavior, you know, but they also drive our perceptions in all the ways that Freud thought about. You know, and one of the things I really like about the psychoanalysts is that they never make the mistake of assuming that a motivational system or an emotional system is a mechanical system that reacts deterministically. They say, no, those things are like personalities. And that's much more sophisticated viewpoint than the typical behaviorist or the typical cognitive psychologist, you know, because they tend to think of the computer in either stimulus-response terms, so it's basically deterministic chains, or as if the information processing system is a computational apparatus, which it is, but it's not only that, you know, it's an embodied computational apparatus, and the body is a very sophisticated thing. You know, it's been very difficult for us to build embodied robots. And it's also the case that until you build embodied robots, the things don't really get smart. You know, you have to have a body for the thing to actually have any intelligence. And that was actually figured out by a robotics engineer named Rodney Brooks back in the 1990s, 92, 93. He published a couple of papers on that, saying, you know, that if we were going to build artificial intelligence, we shouldn't start from the top down. We shouldn't build a world modeling machine and then embed it in something that moves around. We should build something that sort of moves around semi-autonomously like a stupid insect. And insects aren't stupid, so I do mean a stupid insect. And if we could manage that, we'd really be doing something. You know, and I think we might have got beyond the stupid insect level of robots so far. And, you know, it's starting to ramp up really fast, but it's in large part because the things are embodied. And so, because it is the case, as we've discussed, that your perceptual, your cognitive perceptual motor systems have to be embedded in an output system that can interact with the world in order for them to be doing anything that's actual or real. So anyways, back to the hypothalamus. Roughly speaking, and I'm no expert on hypothalamic function, and I had to pound my way through Swanson's paper because it's quite complex, you know. But the hypothalamus is sort of the nexus between the brain, the mind, and the body. That's one way of thinking about it. And it's very good at monitoring your body, the states of your body, and it can figure out basically when your blood sugar is too low and when you need water, and when you, I don't exactly remember how it's associated with the regulation of breathing, because I suspect that that's a different system, and I don't remember that being a subcomponent of the hypothalamus. But it does also regulate things like sexual behavior and sexual attraction and temperature regulation and excretion and you know, all the things that you would associate with the basic biological functions that come along with being a complex animal. And, you know, we share those functions way down the evolutionary chain. You know, we share a lot of the functions with everything that moves. Approach and avoidance we share with pretty much everything that moves. And by the time you get to the higher mammalian functions, you know, we share those with pretty much all mammals. That's partly why we can understand mammals pretty well. You know, you can kind of have a lizard as a pet, and some of them are more social than others. But, you know, to really have a pet, it has to be a mammal. And it's even better if it's a social mammal, like a dog, because, you know, you can understand dogs and they can understand you because they're hierarchical animals and they have the same, roughly, the same set of biological functions that you do. You know, their brains are organized around smell and not around vision. And almost all animals are like that, except for people and maybe hunting birds. You know, so that's one thing that really distinguishes us from dogs. But we're similar enough in our embodied behavior so that we can directly relate to dogs, and, you know, they can even play. And play is a circuit. So there's a guy named Jaak Panksepp, J-A-A-K, Panksepp, P-A-N-K-S-E-P-P, who I would roundly recommend that you read if you're interested in in behavioral neuroscience. I think he's a genius. He's sort of on par with Gray as far as I'm concerned, and on par with Swanson. And Panksepp, I believe, discovered the play circuit in mammals, and so, 2 thumbs up for him. That's a big deal. That's kind of like discovering a continent from the psychological perspective. And it's a circuit that's separate from exploration, which is kind of interesting because you think about play as a form of exploratory behavior, but it's sufficiently different from standard exploratory behavior that it has a circuit that's devoted to it. And there's a lot of primary circuits, and they're networked in with the rest of the brain, and obviously circuit is a metaphor. So I could say there's a lot of primary sub-personalities. They're like one-eyed monsters. There's only one thing they're after, and there's a whole bunch of them. And so roughly speaking, they regulate the things I already mentioned that the hypothalamus regulates: defensive aggression, sexual behavior, temperature regulation, food and water intake, excretion. Well, then there's one for breathing. Then there's another for pain. Then there's another for anxiety. And there's another for exploration. And there's others. There's sensory modules as well. There's a visual circuit and an auditory circuit and an olfactory circuit and a circuit that's devoted to taste. And there's a circuit that keeps track of how your body is localized in space. That's a parietal circuit. And what else is important? Oh yeah, there's a circuit that you can use to abstractly model perceptual structures and patterns of behavior before you implement them in the world. And that seems to be a higher cortical function fundamentally, and you dissociate that with the contents of your consciousness. There's a language circuit. There's an empathy circuit that mediates maternal behavior. There's a hunting circuit that mediates predatory behavior. There's a circuit to check dominance and subordination. There's a circuit that mediates creativity in human beings. There's a circuit that mediates social activity, and the positive reinforcing nature of social activity, and that's quite tightly associated with the exploratory circuit. Let's see. Well, that's not too bad for a beginning. I'm sure I've missed some, and I'll remember them. And each of those subsystems is important enough so that there's a neural architecture devoted to it. Now, some of those neural architectures are flexible enough so that if they don't develop in one brain area, they'll develop in another. So it's not exactly as if the location of these functions is specifically determined in advance before development. So, for example, if you have a baby and it has, epilepsy, and the epilepsy is really bad, sometimes they'll take out the whole left or right hemisphere. And if they do that early enough, it doesn't really seem to have much consequence for the baby. Which is pretty weird. You think, well, half the brain, that's probably fairly useful. But in some sense, it's as if the cortical elements of the brain are territory that can be inhabited and colonized by the lower levels of the brain. And so you could say that the lower levels of the brain, including the visual input systems, would just as soon colonize what we call the visual cortex. But if there's no visual cortex, because it's been removed, then they'll just go colonize part of the auditory cortex. And what you see in other situations sometimes is that people have hydrocephaly, and what that means is that their cerebral spinal fluid builds up in their brain, and so the ventricles get very enlarged. And so if you take an X-ray or an MRI or other sort of scan of these people, you'll find that their entire skull is full of water, except for like a half-inch thin slice of cortical tissue around the water like a balloon. And one of the guys who was like that had a PhD in mathematics from Cambridge. 5% of his brain tissue was intact. Now, it was pretty active, that 5%, and you could also be sure that it would not have been very resilient to damage. So part of the reason that we have an excess of cortical tissue, so to speak, is because, we need to be resilient to assaults and trouble. And it does appear, perhaps, this is the sort of discussion that got Larry Summers kicked out of Harvard. It looks like men are somewhat more differentiated in their cortical function than women, and what that means is that there is a very small subset of spatial skills that men seem to have an advantage in, but the price they pay for that is that they're much more susceptible to brain malfunction and also to brain damage, because they don't have redundancy built in to the same degree women do. And that's part of the reason why there are far more boys who have learning disabilities, for example, than there are women. So